The fact that this anniversary coincides with the founding of the nation, something that's not, in fact, entirely coincidental, as many of you know, adds even more to the significance of our program today and those that we planned for through the 25-26 school year. Our goal with today's events is to encourage us to consider the role of anniversaries, whether it's a personal event like a birthday or an event with regional or national or international significance. There is something about years that end in zeros and sometimes fives and maybe ones if you're a student that carries a particular weight. It's a chance to reflect on how the passage of time has changed or not changed the ways in which we assign meaning to our lives, and in this case to the institution to which we are attached in so many and complex ways. And I can think of no one better suited to help us embark on this journey of reflection than our speaker tonight. And on a personal note, I've long admired our speaker's work, and it's a thrill to welcome her to campus, and I may even be a fangirl, as we were just discussing, so it's really exciting to have her here. Before I introduce her, I want to extend a few thank yous. First to the co-sponsors for tonight's event, the Office of Culture and Inclusion, the Department of History, the Lectures and Programs Committee, and the Wilson Center. Thank you very much for your support. Also to my steering committee colleagues, Tommy Shomo and Jean Hickok. Tommy has come out of retirement to help us as a true labor of love, for which I am deeply grateful, and we should all be very grateful to him for his many years of service. Thank you also to Shauna Hunter and Mike Utzinger for their work as chairs of our subcommittees and our many other committee members, and it takes a village to plan an anniversary for sure. So with those thank yous out of the way, let me introduce Ms. Coleman as our speaker tonight. Christy Coleman has served as the Chief Executive Officer at some of the nation's most prominent museums. She is a tireless advocate for the power of museums, narrative correction, diversity, and inclusiveness. Ms. Coleman is an innovator and leader in the museum field, having held multiple very prominent leadership roles at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History, and the American Civil War Museum. She now serves as the executive director of the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation. Ms. Coleman is the recipient of numerous awards for her decades of impact, including 3 honorary doctorates, and in 2018, Time Magazine named her one of the 31 people changing the South. In 2019, Worth Magazine named her one of 29 women changing the world. She's an accomplished screenwriter, public speaker, and has appeared on several national news and history programs. She was the historical consultant for the award-winning film Harriet and Showtime's Good Lord Bird, which I loved, and with other projects in the queue. And most recently, she's appeared in award-winning documentaries, including Grant, Abraham Lincoln, Black Patriots, Civil War Heroes, Neutral Ground, and When the Monuments Came Down. So I hope you will join me in giving her a warm welcome.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out and participating in this conversation about how shall we remember. Now, I have to say I got to do this now. I lost my glasses sometime of packing and coming here, so I found these little ones. So if I stumble, forgive me. I'll just say that up front. But thank you again so much for having me here. And I'm really struck by how we think about what is important historically, right? I mean, as we were having dinner and we were chit-chatting and what have you, people are often surprised to learn that I actually grew up in Williamsburg. I mean, people don't think that people actually live there. Right? But I actually grew up in Williamsburg. I mean, that's my backyard. We used to ride our bikes and goof on the tourists every summer, right? But there's another part of Williamsburg that I didn't discover because of the way history is taught until actually I was like 17. I was a senior in high school. And that fact of the community that I was in, this community that I was a part of with this church that I belonged to being the First Baptist Church, established in 1776, was my home church, and black church, right? And all of these things. The one thing that I didn't learn about my own community was that on the eve of the American Revolution, the city was 52% black. And so subsequently, I had to think why was it that nobody knew that? I mean, we were right here. And I realized, well, there were a lot of people who knew it. It's just that that wasn't shared with the public. Because more often than not, what happens and how we choose to remember the historic is actually wrapped up in something called nostalgia. And nostalgia isn't necessarily a bad thing, but when it is, it causes significant harm. Because nostalgia is about creating something that never was to make us feel good about where we are. Tonight I've heard the term probably 6 different times. History is complex. That's an overstatement. History isn't complex. The world that we live in is involved with all of these different peoples. All of these different peoples interacting, having a say, having a thought, having a voice, having, a series of conversations that are happening simultaneously. This is essentially what history is. Does that make it complex? Meaning it's too convoluted for us to understand? Not at all. That's why I love my friends in academia, because they can take that one little piece right there and inspect it with such, oh my God, right? They can tell you about the fruit trees that grow in the valley from 1432, right? But that's what they do. They help us see and pick out. And what museums do is a little different. What we do is we are actually the ones who bring all of this academic knowledge together and then try to dispense it in 250 words or less, right, to a general public. That's where the complexity is. Because it is in those moments that we are choosing what we will remember. We are choosing and making value statements about the past. And more often than not, well, in the words of Sting, history will teach us nothing, because the sordid and the powerful are the architects of time, right? I don't necessarily believe that, because that's very pessimistic. I have a slightly different view about it. In fact, one of the things that I've come to understand is that when we think about the study of history, it's also and always has been more about how we are, again, framing the present. Every generation is bringing to the past, this forensic thing that we call the past, our own set of questions. And our questions are tied up in a sense of belonging and need. We need to understand how we're connected to each other. We need to understand how we got here. We need to understand where we're going. And so we go back to the past inevitably to try to find those answers. And it's a really complex thing. See, there it is. But not really. It is about us trying to find connection. It is the most human, basic need. The problem comes when we decide to value one need over another. My peers in the history memory business, and yes, there is a subset of historical memory studies, right? They have a whole framework, but I'm going to break it down to 3 basic parts that we have to deal with in my world, which is in the museum environment. Because we recognize that our public that is coming to us, there are those 3 elements that they are constantly trying to navigate. There is actually the history. And this is more than the date or the person or the place or the thing or how it happened. It is a forensic accounting of the past. So that forensic accounting may be the diary, the archaeology, the oral history, the DNA. All of these things are the forensic evidence that has been left to us. But then there's this thing called heritage. And that is the beast. Because heritage making is around this desire for communities to find cohesion. And sometimes in finding cohesion or in even building community, they lie to themselves. And I'm going to give you all the perfect example. Perfect. I don't care about your background. I guarantee you've heard these three things, and I want you to raise your hand and show me that you have. How many of you in this room have heard or learned George Washington could never tell a lie, he had wooden teeth, and he chopped down a cherry tree? Raise your hand. Now, this particular heritage making is over 200 years old. And the reality is none of it is true. Not one piece of it is true. Of course, he lied. He was a spy, if nothing else. And social scientists tell us, based on evidence, that the average person lies about 30 times a day. Now, we're not talking about massive deception here. We're talking about the little things. Honey, does my hair look good today? Do you like my beard? Do I smell funny? We don't want to hurt each other, so we lie. Lies of omission, lies of kindness. But according to social scientists, we do this about 30 times a day. So of course George lied. The cherry tree thing. Did you know that George Washington, actually, his father died when he was young, and he was actually raised by his single mom, who actually was an indentured servant for one part of her life, and that, in fact, did you know that? No, of course you didn't. Right? His brother, he wants to follow, his brother off to the Navy, and his mom was like, no, not my baby. Yeah, so Dad wouldn't have been there. Plus the fact those, cherry trees like that didn't grow there, right? We don't have them. But the most pernicious part of that is the wooden teeth story. Now, y'all are giggling because you know. Some of you clearly know. We have two sets of George Washington's false teeth in museum collections. One is actually at Mount Vernon, and the other is at the National Dentistry Museum, right? And we also have the records of his French dentist and George Washington's own journal and records. And his false teeth were actually made from ivory and the teeth of the enslaved that he purchased or acquired, depends on which set. Now, the question becomes, and I need you to think about it. Did y'all hear that? Because some of y'all are like, did she just say? Yeah, ivory and human teeth were in his mouth, and the human teeth came from his slaves. So, now let's back it up. Why would this particular heritage making, why in the world would that persist for over 200 years? Because we needed it to. This young nation, the way we love to say the young nation, we were talking at dinner tonight, you had 13 colonies. Each of them were established for one purpose and one purpose only, and that was to make money for the particular stock company that started them. Whether it was the Massachusetts Bay Company, whether it was the Virginia Indian Company, it didn't matter. They were stock companies that started these. That's what they were. Until, the crown, James decides he's got to take over Virginia because they're creating such a mess down there with all the indigenous, and they're having wars every couple of years, and people are killing themselves, and you got the Powhatan Offensive of 1622, it nearly wipes out the colony again, and then you have what happened down there in North Carolina, which wasn't called North Carolina. But my point is, we've got these 13 very different economies, some of them influenced by a lot of different reasons why people were settling there in spaces that were already occupied. And that's just 13. We're not even talking about the Spanish to the south, which we always seem to leave them out when we're talking about the establishment of America. America had what became America. We had the French in the valley, in the upper Mississippi Valley. We had Dutch, we had Spanish, we had French, we had Germans. Then you've got all these really interesting denominations that are happening in terms of Protestantism, right? Why did we have to lie about George? Because coming out of that war, we needed somebody to rally around. We needed somebody that we could imbue the values, the virtues of a new nation. And so we lied about it. Does that make it bad? Well, the persistence of the lie probably did. Because instead of having the conversation with each other about the inconsistencies at the founding, which the founders themselves were having those conversations about, instead of thinking about inalienable rights and all men, but not every man, because I can take the teeth out of your mouth and the labor from your loins, is inconsistency. But still there was George. George better than Thomas, George better than John, George better than, because George was the guy on the battlefield and the guy that would lead us in our conversations about constitutionalism, taking this idea one step forward, taking these rowdy kids and turning them into something new, based on ideas that have been fomenting for centuries. I mean, the Declaration of Independence itself is also a historical document. I like to remind people of that. And I don't mean just because of the way we look at it. I mean, literally, after you get through the first portion of it, he lists, Jefferson and everybody, they list 27 things that have happened in the past with the king. History is important, even in establishing our own history. So here we have the forensic. We've talked about heritage. And then the last piece of this is this thing called memory. And memory is something else too. Because memory is really about empathy, about relationships, and about experience. The other problem with memory is it is also highly individual. And we get it wrong. Memory is something as simple as when my family first moved to Williamsburg, I was 8 years old. And the first time that they took me out to Williamsburg, one of the things that they did was we went to, they used to do like candle making and butter churning. And that was just so cool, right? And we're churning the butter, and we're turning the, so cool. Well, by the time I was, actually working there again, we didn't do that. We didn't churn butter, and we didn't make candles. And people were really angry. I mean, so angry. Visitors, employees, the visitors love it. Why aren't we doing it? It's so great. Because historically, it wouldn't have been happening. This was the capital city of the wealthiest of the 13 colonies. They could go down the street and buy that stuff. They had no reason to be making those things in Williamsburg. None. So we stopped doing it, and people were mad. And then there are folks, when we talk about memory, that say things like, and I heard this a lot when I worked at the Civil War Museum, well, you know, my great-great-grandfather, he didn't go to war to keep slavery. He went to protect his neighbors and to protect his community, and that's how it was. And his letters make clear that that is not what the Confederacy was about. That's personal memory and personal experience. When you take the totality of the experience and what is happening in government and what is happening to people, and you add them all together, the story is really quite different. But memory is a powerful thing. We need to remember. And so what did the South do? The South did exactly what the young nation did at its founding in elevating George Washington and creating mythology around him. The South did the exact same thing when it lost. When the Confederacy lost, they did the same thing. They wrapped up their memory into myth-making and dotted our landscape with it to create this idea of their memory as actual history, when in fact it was neither. So we have history, the forensic, the heritage making, you understand why, and then there is this memory piece. And for us in the museum side of the world, our job is to, recognizing all of these things exist, help our visitors wherever they are to drive them all back to the forensic. And once we get them there, to help them understand how we do history. Because history does, at least our understanding of the narrative arcs of history, again, it changes with every generation. And that narrative change is not a bad thing. It is simply because we are asking a different question. And so you go back to the forensic to find the answers, and you try to rebuild it. Or as new information or new technologies come to the fore, it enables you to reinforce what you saw before. My colleagues at Monticello, perfect example. Thomas Jefferson was an untouchable. He was one of the founding greats. He gave us our language of liberty. And yet, from actually 1786, members of the Granger and the Hemmings families knew and passed along in their family lines their genealogy tied directly to that man. They knew. And nope, Jefferson would never do that. Think about what he wrote about here. Think about what he wrote there. And it was like, wait a minute. But if he's literally there, all the other forensics is strongly suggesting that this is the only person it could be, because he's literally there 9 months prior to every birth. And he's traveling a lot. Right? You have the testimony, the oral history, written oral history from Madison Hemmings, who knew who his father was and gave that history of how his parents came to create him and subsequent children, and it was dismissed because we could not see him simply as he was. We could not see him as a man who had promised his wife that he'd never remarry. And then along comes this girl. We call her girl now, but she was considered, hate to say it, y'all, she was technically considered an adult at 15, who walks in that he hasn't seen for a while, and she looks, imagine, she looks like his wife. Because guess what? They were half sisters. And that was a common fact. Everybody knew that. That Jefferson's deceased wife and Sally Hemings were half sisters. They had the same daddy. But it would take us until the early 90s and DNA to prove Madison Hemmings' story because we didn't want to believe it. And we had gotten to a point by the early 90s that we were even daring to ask those questions out loud. Because guess what? We were having conversations about who Kennedy was sleeping with. You know, we had crossed that line that used to be the unspeakable. We had socially crossed the line where we also looked at the proclivities of people in leadership in their lives. Just an example. There are so many more. We've done the same in the Black community, for example, where often our history and culture and learning has occurred in our churches, and in some degrees is starting to happen again in some states, where it's having to revert back to the churches because it is not being taught or being threatened not to be taught in the wider, of course, I won't name any states today. But one of the things that was really, when I was little, one of the things that my grandmother had in their house was this, and I know there's probably not anybody in this room old enough to remember this among my African American audiences or persons of African descent presenting. I'm being sensitive. But when I was growing up, my grandparents had in their house this image on the wall. And the image is usually, and it was replaced. Here's the part that's really crazy, right? So there was an image that they had in the dining room, and it was Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, and Martin Luther King. And it was like this colored thing, like, you know, sort of like Harper's Weekly kind of imagery, right? And then when Kennedy died, what's interesting is Douglass got replaced by Kennedy. And so there was this new image in the house to share this story. The great emancipator, the great freedom fighter. But Black America had a reckoning around Lincoln because of a journalist named Lerone Bennett in Ebony magazine, which was our source, right? And Lerone Bennett said, Lincoln is not the great emancipator. Stop it. He was forced into greatness and wrote this iconic book, even if it had some historical challenges with it. Any historian will tell you that it's problematic on some levels. But he's a journalist. It's okay. First drafts, we get it. But what it did is it made a community, an entire community, begin to question a person that had been venerated as their great emancipator. We even did it to a certain degree, and the folks who know that even with Martin Luther King, the Gen X were like, hold up, y'all knew that he was philanderer? Well, what about Malcolm X? Because Malcolm X, right? We grew up with Denzel Washington stepping out, and we had the big, Africa thing. My point is, everybody uses their history and learns in a really interesting way for what their community needs in that space and in that place and in that time. And in the museum environment and in our communities, I am simply suggesting that we have to be a bit more discerning. We simply have to step back and recognize and ask ourselves the questions: who are we including? Who have we excluded? Whose stories, if we understood them more richly, would benefit all of us? How do we build a community that really has and demonstrates real value to its members? And I don't have the answer to that. But what I do know is that we just can't keep deceiving ourselves around these points. And yet we find ourselves in this moment, right now in this moment. I can cite you several examples coming out of Texas, Florida, Oklahoma, even California, where there's this push and pull between in academia and public history and museums and even in our places of worship. And the public, interestingly enough, even though we think, here's the other thing, we think there's a lot of acrimony, but as we dig deeper, as we look for the nuance that we talk about that we want in our history, the nuance is actually in what the general public is telling us. They're not as divided as you think. What's actually happening is the extremes are being amplified as if they are the primary. And that is not what's happening in the majority of Americans' thought. As a matter of fact, the American Historical Association did a study that showed that when asking the public what is history, what they found was 2/3 did say it's an assemblage of names and dates and events. But when you ask them a little bit further about was history useful and what did they want to learn, 85% I need to know it all. 85% said I need to know it all. And you would never guess that based on the conversations that we have. Now, granted, I say that, but I also recognize that for, the 30 plus years of work in museums, we are not the place that they usually come to get their history. In fact, the number 1 and number 2 places that Americans, anyway, get their history, 69% from documentary films and television. It's not a bad thing, but that's where they get it. They want their history quick, concise, tell me what I need to know, show me something interesting and new. Because I could sit here and do that. I don't have to leave my house. I don't have to pay an admission fee. I can sit here and watch this and learn something and feel good about myself in the moment that may even help me think differently about this later, this bigger thing. 66%, however, get their understanding, the number 2 spot, by the way, from fictional film and TV. This is the historic drama. This is, how many of you watched this is a perfect example of this. How many of you watched a show called The Watchmen? Anybody watch that series on HBO? Okay, so the cool thing about The Watchmen is every episode was a historical lesson embedded in it. First, one night was about the Green Book, the idea of the Green Book, that African Americans, in order to travel the interstate highway systems, had to have this specific book that helped identify where they could safely travel and spend the night and buy food. They were called the Green Books. Finding these safe places to travel in America where they didn't have to worry about dating. So there was another episode where they were dealing with Greenwood district in Tulsa. And what was stunning to me as I'm watching people's reaction to this, it started trending like on social media, and I was like, why is the Tulsa massacre trending? What in the heck is going on now? And it's because people were watching a show and didn't know it was real, didn't know Tulsa actually happened. So don't even get me started about all the other riots that were happening in the United States between 1915 and 1923, and then the next set that happens after World War II, let alone what happens in the 1960s. They weren't new, but the public didn't know about it. And that's why I tend to, when I'm asked to work with production companies, whether they're doing fiction or whether they're doing documentary, because it's an opportunity to help get the stories right. Producers and writers will tell you all the time, we're not going to let the history get in the way of a good story, right? And I'm like, well, my job is to make sure your good story is authentic, and to give you some options when you run up against something that I cannot put my name on. right? And so we go through this exercise, and it's really been kind of fun watching how this process, because the reason why I do it is because I know 66% of y'all think what you're seeing in these movies are real. Whether it's Queen Charlotte, the Bridgerton, right? The Patriot.
Oh my God.
Pocahontas. That movie caused Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation so much trauma. Everybody was coming looking for Mother Willow and the cliffs that they could jump off of, none of which existed, and then got their feelings hurt when they find out that she's really a little girl. Oh, I know. They got their feelings hurt. And a little bit even more so when they got out to our Paspahay town, which formerly used to be called the Powhatan Indian Village. When I went to work there, I changed that because it wasn't appropriate. Again, see how this works? So much time, effort to say the James Fort, the recreation of James Fort, the recreation of the Susan Constant Discovery and the Godspeed. A Powhatan Indian village, when in fact it had been recreated based on actual archaeological evidence of a real place called Paspahay. So that's what we're gonna call it. Oh, well, the visitors' memories, they're only gonna remember, we'll teach them. They'll figure it out, right? We can change, we can grow, we can explore each other. It is a relationship that we are in, people. As Americans, we are in a relationship with each other as we try to build for, yes, it's gonna sound hokey, but that more perfect union. We've got a lot of mess to clean up. And the mess that we have been cleaning up, again, has been wrapped up in this nostalgic heritage making instead of real history. And the thing, it is so ingrained in our identity that when you begin to deconstruct it, it feels like an attack. And it really isn't. What it is people saying, I'm in this story too, you know. And what you are feeling is what I have suffered with for generations. So just like me as that little kid who didn't know until she was 17 that my hometown, one of the most important places in the colonial record, that every other face you would have seen on those streets looked like mine. And I was never told that. I was never told that. You probably don't know that if you ever visited it. That's harm. It is like, and we have to deal with it, right? So this is one of my favorite analogies. It's like us as a family trying to deal with Uncle Sam's drinking. Because when Uncle Sam drinks, he gets mean. And sometimes he hits, sometimes he fights, and he hurts. But when Uncle Sam ain't drinking, he's a good dude. We laugh, we joke, he takes us places, he takes us to the store, he does this, he does that. We take these really cool trips. But my uncle drinks. He's a drunk. Causes harm. So we can keep pretending when we talk about Uncle Sam, we can keep pretending that those things, those harms that he has caused us don't exist because they don't make us feel good. Doesn't help Aunt Mary feel good when we talk about that. Because we're not talking about the good things that Uncle Sam did for us. But here's the thing. In order for that family to truly heal, not only do they have to acknowledge Uncle Sam's alcoholism, but they got to acknowledge that the disease has impacted every single one of the family. And if we're really going to heal, it's time for us to get to AA and Al-Anon and all those other things that we need to do to address that problem so we can help Uncle Sam get better. That's kind of where we're at. There is a lot of harm in our country. And yes, there's a lot of amazing things that have happened in our country that have benefited us all. And probably the most compelling moment did happen when these words, taken from Greek philosophers and the ancients, it wasn't just Greek, by the way, the studying of enlightenment and all of these ideas that were flowing throughout Europe and Northern Africa and all of it, touches of Buddhism and all of this is happening. And it becomes distilled into a language that even people it was intended to include could embrace it and demand it. That is why commemorating the 250th of the Declaration of Independence is important. That is the kind of thing that you all as a campus need to think about when you're considering your 250th anniversary. How shall we remember? We shall remember that we were all here. And there was always a story to tell. In this place, in this moment in time, but also in this larger context. There are the opportunities for cohesion when there is honesty. There are those moments for being and creating and moving forward and finding common ground. That's where it is. And I say that as someone who has seen it happen even in the most contentious of environments. Because it is in those spaces that we're able to build empathy. And when you build empathy and you let someone understand that they are actually being heard, you don't have to agree, but being heard and not condescended to, but to be heard. And what you hear is that everybody is after the same thing. It is only in the extremity that we find a divisiveness that has managed to weave its way through and convince all of us that our neighbor is that guy. But the studies don't show that at all. We can be honest about our history. We can be compelling. We can be true. We can continue to explore, and we can continue to ask the questions that will help us build towards this more remarkable experience that we're after. So, with all of that said, I am going to leave you with this last study that was done, also as a part of that larger one with AAH study, when 75% of respondents, survey respondents, said, yes, it is absolutely acceptable to have discomfort with subject matters. It tracks with another study called Diffusing the History Wars. And again, only 14% were represented on either side of the extremity. Everyone else in the middle said, it's our history, it's real, it's true, we ought to learn it. So, go boldly. Go boldly. Find those things that help you embrace a local theme that I understand that you all have pulled together called the civic virtue, defining civic virtue for your communities here. And as you do that, as you explore these ideas, keep in mind that the person sitting across you is your community member too. That's the key right there. They're a part of your community too. And if you stop yelling at each other long enough, you will realize that both of y'all are more than likely in that 75 to to 85 percentile.